Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark Channel. I'm so excited to have you here today. Are you ready to improve your English listening and speaking skills while diving into an exciting mystery? Today, we have a thrilling story that will help you enhance your comprehension, build confidence, and speak more fluently, all while keeping you entertained. So, get comfortable, stay focused, and let's begin this immersive English learning experience together. Let's get started and light up your English journey. Chapter 1. The Whispering Graveyard. It was a quiet night in the small village of Ravenshire. The air was crisp, and the moon hung low, casting eerie shadows over the old cobblestone streets. The only sounds were the distant hoots of an owl and, the rustling of leaves in the cold wind. But at the cemetery on the edge of town, something felt different, something unseen, something waiting. Sergeant Daniel Carter had just settled into his desk at the Ravenshire police station when the phone rang. He glanced at the clock, 12:23 a.m. No one ever called this late unless it was something serious. Ravenshire Police, Sergeant Carter speaking. A frail, trembling voice came through the receiver. It was Mrs. Holloway, an elderly widow who lived near the cemetery. Sergeant, I don't mean to trouble you, but I saw something outside. Strange lights, shadows moving, and voices, whispering voices in the graveyard. Daniel sighed. He had heard this before. Over the years, the Ravenshire cemetery had gained a reputation among the locals. Some swore it was haunted. Others believed it was just the wind playing tricks on the mind. Then there were the teenagers. Every so often, a group of them would sneak in, lighting candles, playing eerie music, and scaring themselves for fun. All right. Mrs. Holloway, stay inside and keep your doors locked. I'll go check it out. Grabbing his torch, Daniel headed out. The drive to the cemetery was short, too short. As he got closer, an uneasy sensation crept up his spine. The old iron gate stood partially open, swaying slightly in the wind. Beyond them, the cemetery stretched into the darkness, its weathered gravestones casting long, menacing shadows. The towering angel statues loomed like silent sentinels over the dead. As soon as Daniel stepped out of his car, he spotted candlelight flickering deeper inside. A group of teenagers stood huddled in a circle, whispering. Their voices carried on the wind a rhythmic, eerie chant. Switching on his torch, Daniel walked forward. All right, that's enough fun for tonight, he called out. A girl, pale, wide-eyed, barely 14 years old, gasped as she saw him and stumbled back. A taller boy, likely the ringleader, stepped forward, trying to look defiant. "We're not doing anything illegal," the boy said. Daniel shone his torch around. Wax dripped from half-melted candles onto the moss-covered graves. Symbols were drawn in chalk on the ground. Not satanic, but strange nonetheless. "Summoning ghosts, are we?" he asked dryly. "We're trying to contact the spirit of Eleanor Winslow," a girl whispered. Daniel sighed. Eleanor Winslow, the local legend, the wife of the famous artist Martin Winslow, who had mysteriously vanished in 1956. Some said she had been murdered. Others believed she had run away. Over time, stories grew. Tales of a woman in green wandering the graveyard at night, searching for something or someone. "Well, I hate to break it to you, but Mrs. Winslow isn't here to take your requests," Daniel said. "Now pack up and go home before your parents start wondering where you are." Most of them grumbled, but began blowing out the candles and gathering their things. As Daniel turned to leave, something caught his eye. A symbol freshly painted onto the door of the old caretaker's house, a circle with 3 stars inside it, drawn in dark yellow paint. "Did one of you do this?" he asked, shining his light over the door. The teenagers exchanged confused glances. "What?" "No," the tall boy said. Cold gust of wind blew past, extinguishing the last candle. The air turned noticeably colder, and for a moment the cemetery was dead silent. No rustling leaves, no distant owl hoots, nothing. Then Daniel heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but too deliberate to be just a trick of nature. It came from inside the caretaker's house. The young girl, the one who had gasped earlier, clutched her arms tightly. The others laughed nervously, but Daniel could see the unease in their eyes. Even the tall boy was looking at the old house a little too long. He stepped closer to the door, resting a hand on his baton. "Is someone inside?" he called out. No answer. Daniel tried the door handle. Locked, just as it had been for years. He pressed, his ear against the wood. Silence. Another gust of wind blew past, and suddenly the whispering returned. But this time it was behind him. He spun around, torchlight cutting through the darkness. No one was there. The teenagers were now silent, staring at him, as if they suddenly realized they had gone too far. "Go home," Daniel said, his voice lower this time. They didn't argue. One by one, they turned and left the cemetery, hurrying back toward the village. Daniel took one last look at the caretaker's house, the symbol on the door, and the empty space behind him where he could have sworn someone had whispered his name. Then he got into his car and drove away. But something told him he wasn't finished with the whispering graveyard just yet. Chapter 2. The Missing Painting. The morning after his unsettling visit to the Ravenshire cemetery, Sergeant Daniel Carter arrived at the police station earlier than usual. The eerie whisper from the night before still echoed in his mind, but he pushed it aside. Ghost stories didn't belong in police work. He had barely settled at his desk when the phone rang. Ravenshire Police, Sergeant Carter speaking. A frantic voice answered. Sergeant, it's Margaret Caldwell from the Winslow Art Gallery. There's been a break-in. One of the paintings, one of the Winslow originals, is gone. Daniel grabbed his notepad. All right, Margaret, slow down. When did you notice the painting was missing? I just got here 10 minutes ago. The front door was still locked when I arrived. But when I went inside, oh God, Daniel, one of the display cases was smashed. I'm on my way, he said, already reaching for his keys. The Winslow Art Gallery sat on the edge of the village, housed in a grand 18th century estate that had been converted into a museum after Martin Winslow. The town's most famous artist mysteriously vanished in 1956. As Daniel pulled up, he could see Margaret Caldwell, the museum curator, waiting for him outside. She was a short, silver-haired woman in her 60s, her eyes wide with distress. Daniel, thank goodness you're here, she exclaimed, wringing her hands. Show me what happened, he said. She led him inside. Despite its age, the Winslow Gallery was well kept, its wooden floors polished to perfection, its high ceilings adorned with chandeliers. Rows of classic oil paintings lined the walls, all depicting serene landscapes, distant mountains, and rolling green fields. But as Daniel entered the main exhibit room, he immediately saw the problem. One of the glass display cases had been shattered, shards littering the floor. An empty frame hung on the wall, its canvas missing. What was here? Daniel asked. Margaret took a deep breath. It was called The Lady in Green, one of Martin Winslow's most famous paintings. Daniel frowned. Describe it to me. Margaret pointed to a photo on the nearby brochure stand. The Lady in Green was a hauntingly beautiful painting of a woman in an emerald-colored dress, standing in a misty field. Her face was slightly turned away, making her identity unclear. Her hair was long and dark, flowing in the wind. The brush strokes gave her an almost ghostly appearance. It was painted in 1955, just a year before Winslow disappeared, Margaret explained. There's a legend that the woman in the painting is his wife, Eleanor Winslow. Daniel's stomach tightened. Eleanor Winslow, he murmured. The same Eleanor the teenagers were trying to contact in the graveyard last night. Margaret's eyes widened. Wait, you saw kids at the cemetery? They were messing around, trying to summon Eleanor's spirit, Daniel said. They mentioned something about her searching for something, or someone. Margaret looked pale. There's an old story, she said quietly, that Eleanor's spirit won't rest until she finds what was lost. Some say she's looking for her husband. Others say she's looking for something he took from her. Daniel crossed his arms. And now her portrait is missing. Margaret nodded grimly. I can't explain it, Daniel. The security system was armed. All night. The doors were locked from the inside. Nothing else was stolen. Just that one painting. Daniel's mind raced. A high-value theft? Possible. But why only take one piece? And why this particular one? He examined the broken display case, then crouched down to look at the shattered glass. He spotted a few drops of blood. The thief cut themselves breaking in, he said. I'll have forensics analyze this. Then something else caught his eye. On the wooden floorboards, right beneath the empty frame, there was a symbol drawn in yellow chalk, a circle with 3 stars inside it. Daniel froze. He had seen this before. Last night, on the door of the old caretaker's house in the cemetery. Margaret, he said slowly. Has anyone else reported seeing this symbol before? Margaret hesitated. Not in recent years, she admitted. But in the 1950s, when Winslow was still alive, this symbol was found painted on his studio walls. It's said to have something to do with his final unfinished work, a painting he never completed. Daniel's pulse quickened. Do we have any records of that painting? Margaret shook her head. No one ever saw it. After Winslow disappeared, his studio was sealed off, and most of his belongings were sold or lost. But some say he was obsessed with that last piece, and that it had something to do with his wife. Daniel stared at the empty frame. Something wasn't right. If this was just a random theft, why would the burglar leave behind valuable paintings and take only this one? And why was the same mysterious symbol appearing both in the gallery and in the cemetery? One thing was certain. Whoever took the lady in green wasn't finished yet. Chapter 3. The Woman in Green. The sun was sinking behind the rolling hills of Ravenshire as Sergeant Daniel Carter sat in his office. staring at the photo of the stolen painting, The Lady in Green. The woman in the portrait seemed to watch him, her dark flowing hair swept by an unseen wind, her face turned slightly away, her emerald dress blending into the misty background. There was something unsettling about it, something almost alive. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. The forensic team had just confirmed that the blood found at the crime scene belonged to an unknown individual. There were no matches in the database. That meant either the thief had never been arrested before, or they weren't in any official records at all. And then there was that symbol, a circle with 3 stars inside, the same one found painted on the abandoned caretaker's house in the cemetery. The same one linked to Martin Winslow's missing final work. Something wasn't adding up. Daniel needed answers, and he knew exactly who to ask. The artist's last studio. By the time Daniel arrived at Ravenshire Historical Society, the sun had disappeared entirely, casting the village into darkness. The society was housed in an old brick building, filled with archives, artifacts, and records of the town's past. Inside, James Whitmore, the town historian, was waiting for him. A thin man in his late 60s, James had devoted his life to uncovering the secrets of Ravenshire's past. "Sergeant Carter," he greeted. "What brings you here so late?" Daniel held up the photograph of the missing painting. "I need to know everything you have on Martin Winslow," he said. James raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the lady in green? You know about it?" James smiled knowingly. "I know about her," he corrected. He gestured for Daniel to follow him. The 2 men walked down a dimly lit corridor until they reached a locked wooden door. James took out a ring of old keys, selected one, and turned the lock. Inside was a dusty storage room lined with shelves full of ancient books, paintings, and documents. At the center of the room stood a single easel, draped with a white cloth. James approached it and carefully pulled the cloth away. Daniel stepped closer. It was another painting of the lady in green, but this one was unfinished. The same mysterious woman in the emerald dress, the same misty landscape, but her face was missing. Instead of features, there was just a shadow, an empty void where her eyes should have been. Daniel felt a chill creep up his spine. "This was Martin Winslow's final painting," James said quietly. "The one he never finished." Daniel tore his gaze away from the canvas. "Why didn't he finish it?" James hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Because the night before he planned to complete it, he disappeared." The vanishing of Martin Winslow? James led Daniel to an old filing cabinet and pulled out a yellowed folder. Martin Winslow was last seen on the evening of August 12, 1956, James explained. According to his wife, Eleanor, he had been acting strangely for weeks, talking about dreams of a woman calling his name, spending hours locked in his studio, obsessing over this painting. Daniel flipped through the police report from the time. There was no sign of a struggle, he murmured. James shook his head. He left everything behind, his car, his money, even his clothes, just vanished into the night. Some people say he ran away. Others think he lost his mind. And then there are those who believe. James hesitated. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Believe what? James exhaled slowly. That Eleanor Winslow wasn't his wife at all. Daniel stared at him. What do you mean? James picked up another old newspaper clipping and handed it to Daniel. The headline read, Mysterious Woman Arrives in Ravenshire. Who is Martin Winslow's muse? The article described how, in 1954, Martin Winslow had returned from a trip to France with a woman no one had ever seen before. He introduced her as his wife, Eleanor, but the villagers were suspicious. She never spoke of her past, never mentioned a family, and was rarely seen outside their estate. Even stranger, after Martin disappeared, she vanished as well. No records, no history. As if she had never existed, James murmured. Daniel set down the clipping, his mind racing. A woman who appeared out of nowhere, a painter obsessed with her, and then both of them gone without a trace. And now her painting was missing. He took a deep breath. James, he said, do you have any photos of Eleanor Winslow? James nodded and handed him a black and white portrait. Daniel took one look at it and felt his stomach drop. It was her, the woman from The Lady in Green. The same haunting eyes, the same flowing dark hair, the same emerald dress. But this photo had been taken 2 years before Martin painted her. Daniel's fingers tightened around the picture. If Eleanor Winslow was just a model, why did Martin paint her over and over again? And why was her image still haunting Ravenshire in paintings that shouldn't exist? A visitor in the dark as. Daniel drove home that night. His thoughts were a storm of questions. The symbol at the crime scene, the unfinished painting, the disappearance of Martin and Eleanor. None of it made sense. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and stepped out of the car. Then he felt it, a presence. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching him, Slowly, he reached for his gun, scanning the street. The village was quiet, the houses dark, but there, at the far end of the road, he saw something. A woman standing beneath a street lamp, her long emerald dress rippling in the wind. Daniel's breath caught. It was her. He blinked, and she was gone. Chapter 4. An old friend's secrets. The morning sun barely pushed through the thick gray clouds over Ravenshire as Sergeant Daniel Carter pulled up in front of an old bookshop at the edge of the village. The wooden sign above the door read, Wainwright's. Rare books and antiquities. Daniel knew this place well. It belonged to Samuel Wainwright, an old friend, and one of the most knowledgeable historians in town. If anyone knew more about the missing painting, The Lady in Green, the symbol found at the crime scene, and the mysterious Eleanor Winslow, it was Sam. He stepped out of the car, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The Cryptic Scholar. The shop smelled of old parchment, ink, and time itself. Towering wooden bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each one filled with ancient texts, leather-bound tomes, and fragile manuscripts. At the center of it all sat Samuel Wainwright, hunched over a massive dust-covered book, his thin-framed glasses sliding down his nose. A cane rested against the desk beside him, and a steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched nearby. As soon as Daniel stepped inside, Sam didn't even look up. "You're late," Sam muttered, flipping a page. Daniel smirked. "I didn't know we had an appointment." "You didn't," Sam said dryly, finally glancing up. His sharp, piercing eyes studied Daniel for a moment. "But I figured you'd show up. You always do when Ravenshire starts whispering its secrets." Daniel chuckled, but then grew serious. "I need your help, Sam. It's about the Lady in Green, the painting that was stolen from the Oswald Gallery." Sam closed his book with a loud thud, dust rising in the air. "The one by Martin Winslow?" he asked. Daniel nodded. Sam sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that. The artist and the mystery woman." Sam reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder stuffed with old papers and photographs. He slid it across the desk toward Daniel. "I started looking into Martin Winslow years ago," Sam admitted. "He was a talented artist, no doubt, but his last few years were strange." Daniel flipped open the folder and saw several black and white photos of Winslow in his studio. In one of them, he stood beside a canvas draped in cloth, presumably the Lady in Green before it was revealed. But what caught Daniel's attention was the next photo. A woman standing in the shadows behind Winslow. Her face was blurred, but the outline of her emerald dress was unmistakable. Eleanor Winslow. Daniel frowned. She doesn't look like she wants to be in the picture. She didn't, Sam said. And that's where things get interesting. He tapped a newspaper clipping inside the folder. The headline read, "Local artist's wife missing. No signs of foul play." Daniel skimmed the article. Eleanor Winslow had disappeared 3 weeks before Martin did. But unlike him, she left no trace, no letters, no explanation. It was as if she had simply faded from existence. "People say she wasn't real?" Sam muttered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Sam steepled his fingers. "There are no records of Eleanor Winslow before 1954. No birth certificate, no immigration papers, nothing. She appeared out of nowhere, and then, just as suddenly, she vanished." Daniel leaned back, and now her painted image is disappearing too, he murmured, thinking about the stolen paintings of her. Sam nodded. "Exactly. But there's more. The symbol of the 3 stars." Sam pulled out another yellowed piece of paper. It was a sketch of the symbol, the same 3 stars inside a circle that had been painted on the abandoned caretaker's house. "I've seen this before," Daniel muttered. "You should have," Sam said. "It's older than Ravenshire itself. This symbol appears in medieval texts about the Order of the Australis, an old, secretive group of scholars and mystics." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You think Winslow was involved with them?" "Possibly," Sam said. "There were rumors that he became obsessed with the Order's writings. Some say the Lady in Green wasn't just a painting. It was a portal to something beyond our understanding." Daniel exhaled. "So you're saying that Eleanor Winslow might have been a ghost, a spirit, a curse?" Sam shrugged. "I don't know. But what I do know is that everyone who got too close to this painting disappeared." The letter no one read Sam stood up, wincing as he grabbed his cane. "There's one last thing," he said, limping toward a locked cabinet. He pulled out a small, worn envelope, its edges frayed by time. "This letter was found in Martin Winslow's studio after he vanished," Sam explained. "No one ever paid attention to it because, well, it was never opened." Daniel frowned. "Why not?" "Because it wasn't addressed to anyone," Sam said. "Just a single word written on the front." Daniel took the envelope and turned it over. The faded ink read, "Return." A chill ran down his spine. "Open it," Sam urged. Daniel hesitated. then carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a short message written in hurried, uneven handwriting. Daniel read the words out loud. "She is not what she seems. I made a mistake. I let her in, and now I cannot escape. If you find this, do not look for me. Do not look for her. Burn the painting, send her back, before it's too late." Silence filled the bookshop. Sam met Daniel's gaze. "It was never too late," Sam whispered, "because no one ever listened." Daniel exhaled, gripping the letter tighter. But now someone had. And that meant, for the first time in decades, the lady in green might finally come back. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Eleanor Winslow. A heavy fog rolled over Ravenshire, wrapping the village in an eerie, damp embrace as Sergeant Daniel Carter made his way back to the Oswald Gallery. His mind was still buzzing from the letter he had found. At Sam Wainwright's shop. "She is not what she seems. I made a mistake. I let her in, and now I cannot escape. If you find this, do not look for me. Do not look for her. Burn the painting, send her back, before it's too late." He didn't know what to believe anymore. Martin Winslow's warning felt less like an artist's paranoia and more like a desperate plea. Now, standing in the dim light of the gallery's entrance, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. A disturbance in the gallery, the Oswald Gallery, had been closed to the public since the second robbery. The security cameras were installed, but no one had been inside for the past few nights. As soon as Daniel entered, he felt it. A chill ran down his spine. The air was unnaturally cold. The paintings on the walls, once welcoming, now seemed to loom over him, their subjects watching his every step. A whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind. But there was no wind. Then, a soft, feminine voice. "Daniel." He spun around, flashlight in hand. Nothing. The hall was empty, but something felt wrong. He moved carefully, his shoes clicking against the polished wooden floors. Then he saw it. Single painting had been removed from the wall and placed on the floor, leaning against the opposite wall. His heart stopped. It was another portrait of Eleanor Winslow. This one was different. Unlike the lady in green, which had captured her grace, this painting was disturbing. Her face was turned slightly, but instead of the soft, melancholic expression he had seen in other portraits, this Eleanor had hollow, sunken eyes. Her lips were parted slightly, as if she were about to speak. The strangest part? The Paint was still wet. Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't possible. No one had painted on this canvas in decades. And yet, here it was, freshly altered. He bent down to inspect it closer. The details were deliberate, precise, as if the artist had finished only moments ago. And then he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. In the lower right-hand corner of the painting, a signature, not Martin Winslow's. It read, Eleanor Winslow. His breathing became ragged. This couldn't be real. Eleanor had never been known to paint. Eleanor had disappeared decades ago. Eleanor was dead. The footsteps in the hall, a sudden thud, echoed from the far end of the gallery. Daniel snapped up, every muscle in his body tense. It was coming from the main exhibition hall, where the stolen paintings had once hung. Slowly, he stepped toward the doorway, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Another sound. This time, a soft shuffle, like fabric dragging across the floor. He swallowed hard and entered the hall. The air grew heavier, thick with an unshakable sense of dread. The dim glow of the security lights cast long, unnatural shadows. And then he saw her. A woman standing in the far corner, barely visible in the low light. She wore an elegant, flowing green dress, her long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her head was slightly tilted, her face obscured by the shadows. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor? No response. He took a hesitant step forward. The woman moved slightly, shifting in the darkness. His heart pounded against his ribs. "Who are you?" he demanded. Finally, she lifted her head. The moment he saw her face, an unnatural coldness spread through his body. Her eyes were black, deep, endless voids of nothingness. Her lips curled into a faint smile. "You shouldn't have come here, Daniel." His flashlight flickered. The gallery's security alarms blared, shattering the silence. The lights overhead flashed violently, plunging the room into moments of darkness before illuminating it again. And in those split-second flickers, she moved closer, not stepping, gliding. Daniel stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run. The alarms screamed louder, and then silence. The lights stabilized. The woman was gone. But the painting behind her was missing. Daniel stood there frozen, his breath ragged. His radio crackled to life. "Sergeant." "Carter, what's happening? We've got an alarm trip at the gallery. Backup is en route." Daniel swallowed hard, gripping the radio with trembling fingers. He forced himself to speak. "Someone's taken another painting. The missing portrait, by the time the other officers arrived, the gallery was empty. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone inside. No security footage captured anything out of the ordinary. But the painting was gone. Daniel stood in the main hall, his mind racing. The woman, whoever she was, knew his name. She had spoken to him, and more than that, she had taken something with her. The missing painting? A third portrait of Eleanor Winslow. But this one had a different title, one that sent chills through his bones. On the gallery's record log, it had been catalogued under a single name, Eleanor's Reflection. The reflection that wasn't their Daniel left the gallery that night feeling like he was being watched. His hands were still shaking as he parked outside his small apartment. He climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. He went straight to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, trying to make sense of what had happened. But when he looked up at the mirror, his blood ran cold. For just a fraction of a second, his reflection was missing. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had disappeared, it was back. His heart pounded. It had to be his mind playing tricks on him. It had to be. But deep down, he knew better. Eleanor Winslow was not just a painting. She was something else entirely. And now, she was watching him. Chapter 6. The Fires of Ravenshire. The air in Ravenshire had changed. The village, usually quiet and unassuming, now felt like it was suffocating under a heavy, unseen force. The Oswald Gallery remained closed, its halls empty, but Sergeant Daniel Carter knew that the mystery of Eleanor Winslow was far from over. The missing portrait, Eleanor's reflection, haunted his every thought. The woman he had seen in the gallery, the one who whispered his name, was real. But was she a living person, or was she something else? And then came the fires. Flames in the night. The first fire erupted 2 nights after the second robbery. Daniel was at his desk, poring over the case files, when the call came in. Fire! It's the caretaker's house. The one by the cemetery. His blood ran cold. The same house where he had been knocked unconscious. The same house where the strange symbol had been painted on the door. Daniel grabbed his keys and raced out of the station, his sirens piercing the night as he sped toward the cemetery. By the time he arrived, the old caretaker's house was already engulfed in flames. Thick, black smoke curled into the sky, turning the night into a swirling mess of fire and shadow. Firefighters battled the blaze, their figures illuminated by the inferno. Villagers had gathered nearby, whispering anxiously, their faces flickering. In the orange glow, Daniel leapt out of his car and found Deputy Marcus Hale, who was directing the crowd away from the scene. "What happened?" Daniel shouted over the roar of the fire. "Someone saw a figure near the house," Marcus said grimly. "A woman. She lit the fire and disappeared before anyone could stop her." Daniel's chest tightened. "A woman?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, someone swore they saw a green dress." Daniel felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. Eleanor Winslow. Again. But she was dead, wasn't she? A sinister warning as Daniel watched the fire consume the abandoned house. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was intentional. The missing painting, the strange whispers, the ghostly figure in the gallery. Now, arson. Someone was trying to destroy something. But what? Then one of the firefighters called out, "Sergeant, we found something!" Daniel ran toward the charred remains of the front door, where the firefighter pointed to a new symbol burned into the wood. It was the same 3-star emblem he had seen before. And beneath it, written in blackened soot, were the words, "The fire cleanses, the reflection must burn." Daniel's skin crawled. Reflection. Eleanor's reflection. The stolen painting. His mind was spinning when Marcus approached him again. His face was pale. "Daniel, we've got another problem." "What now?" Marcus hesitated. "The fire chief says the origin of the fire isn't normal." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked at him, dead serious. "No accelerant, no gasoline, no matches, no wiring issues." Daniel's breath caught. It started on its own. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, another call came through on Daniel's radio. "Fire! Another fire at the Winslow estate." The Winslow estate. Burns Daniel drove like a madman. The Winslow estate, once one of the grandest homes in Ravenshire, had been abandoned for decades. Eleanor Winslow had lived there before she vanished. As he sped toward the site, another thought struck him. The first fire had started at the caretaker's house near the cemetery. Now, the Winslow home was burning. What was the connection? When he arrived, the estate was already a towering inferno. The ancient brick walls cracked and groaned from the heat. Flames devoured the roof, sending embers flying into the sky. Daniel ran toward the burning mansion, scanning the crowd. Then, a scream. A woman's scream, coming from inside the house. Daniel's heart nearly stopped. Without thinking, he charged forward. "Daniel, stop!" Marcus grabbed his arm, but he tore free. "There's someone in there," Marcus swore loudly, but Daniel was already through the main doors. Inside the inferno, the heat was unbearable. The walls trembled, and the air shimmered with smoke as Daniel navigated the grand entrance. His eyes watered, and every breath burned his throat. Through the smoke, he saw something. A figure moving up the grand staircase. A woman, a green dress flowing behind her. Eleanor. Daniel felt a rush of adrenaline. He sprinted up the stairs, dodging falling embers and flaming debris. She turned a corner, disappearing into one of the upstairs rooms. Daniel followed. The hallway was collapsing around him, but he pushed forward. And then he saw her, standing in the center of a bedroom, untouched by the flames. She looked exactly as she did in the paintings, Eleanor Winslow. But her face was wrong. Her eyes, dark, empty voids, fixed on Daniel. Her lips moved, but her voice came from everywhere at once. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The fire roared around them. Daniel reached for her, and suddenly she vanished into thin air. The air shifted. A sudden force slammed into his chest, throwing him backward. He hit the ground hard, and the world spun. The roof caved in. The flames surged. The last thing he saw was the ceiling collapsing toward him. And then, blackness. The ashes left behind. Daniel awoke to oxygen being forced into his lungs. Strong hands pulled him from the wreckage of the Winslow estate. The house was gone, reduced to ashes. Marcus was at his side, his face filled with concern. "Jesus, Daniel, you almost died in there." Daniel sat up, his head pounding. The estate was gone. The caretaker's house was gone. And now, 2 places connected to Eleanor Winslow had been purged by fire. Daniel's mind reeled. Had someone been erasing evidence, or was it something else entirely? He forced himself to stand, ignoring the pain in his ribs. The answers weren't in the ashes. They were in the last place left standing, the Oswald Gallery, and more importantly, the last remaining painting of Eleanor Winslow. Chapter 7. The Truth About Eleanor. The ashes of the Winslow estate still smoldered in the distance as Sergeant Daniel Carter pulled himself together. His lungs burned from the smoke, his clothes were covered in soot, and his mind was spinning. Who, or what, was Eleanor Winslow? The fires weren't random. They were deliberate, and someone, or something, was trying to erase the past. There was only one place left that could hold the answers. The Oswald Gallery. A secret locked away. Daniel wasted no time. He drove straight to the gallery, his headlights cutting through the thick mist that had rolled in overnight. The building loomed in the darkness, its once beautiful windows covered in grime, its door standing slightly ajar. His gut told him something was wrong. Daniel reached for his gun and pushed the door open, stepping into the silent hall. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something rotten. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not words, just a breath, like someone standing inches away from him. His hand tightened around his gun. "Who's there?" No answer. The gallery was empty, or at least it looked that way. Daniel's eyes darted to the staircase leading to the archives. That was where the truth had to be, and he knew he wasn't alone. The final portrait. The archival room was filled with dust-covered files, old photographs, and stacks of forgotten paintings. Daniel flicked on the lights, his heart pounding, and then he saw her, not in person, but in paint. A portrait half covered by an old canvas. He stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. The painting was of Eleanor Winslow. But this was not the soft, delicate Eleanor from the previous works. This was different. Her green dress was torn. Her face was contorted, caught between beauty and something monstrous, and her eyes, black, hollow, void. Daniel's stomach turned. This was not a painting meant for display. This was a warning. Then he noticed something else, a nameplate at the bottom of the frame, but it didn't say Eleanor Winslow. It said Eleanor Whitmore. Daniel frowned. That was wrong. Wasn't it? A woman with two names? He dug through the old files, searching for anything that could explain the name change. And then, buried beneath decades-old paperwork, he found it. A marriage certificate. Eleanor. Winslow had never existed. Her real name was Eleanor Whitmore, and she had married Thomas Winslow in 1892. But there was another document, a death certificate, dated 1894 Eleanor. Winslow had died at 23 years old. Daniel felt the room close in around him. If she had died in 1894, then who had been seen walking through Ravenshire? And more importantly, who had been buried in her grave? The Journal of Thomas Winslow. Daniel's hands shook as he flipped through the next set of papers. An old leather-bound journal caught his attention. It was signed Thomas Winslow, Eleanor's husband. He opened the first page. The handwriting was neat, controlled, but as he flipped through, the letters became erratic, messy, filled with fear. He read, "She came back. I saw her with my own eyes. Eleanor." But it was not Eleanor. The woman in my house. She wore her face, but she was not my wife. Daniel's breath quickened. She moved differently. She whispered things I could not understand. The fire would not warm her. The dog would not go near her. And when I looked into her eyes, I saw nothing. Daniel turned the page. I know now that Eleanor Whitmore is dead, but something else wears her skin, and I have made a terrible mistake. Daniel swallowed hard. He turned another page, the final entry. I cannot let her remain. She is not my wife. She is not human. Tomorrow I end it. If I fail, may God forgive me. Daniel felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. Thomas Winslow knew, and he had tried to stop her. But had he? Because Eleanor Winslow, or whatever she had become, was still out there. The reflection must burn. Daniel slammed the journal shut. His head was spinning. This wasn't just about a stolen painting. It wasn't about some ghost story. Something had pretended to be Eleanor Winslow over a century ago. And if she was still out there, then the fires weren't random. They were a cover-up. Someone had been erasing the past, making sure the truth about Eleanor Whitmore was never found. And that meant the last painting, the final portrait of Eleanor Winslow, was in danger. It was the only thing left that held her true image, and someone wanted it destroyed. Daniel grabbed his phone and dialed. "Marcus, meet me at the gallery. Now." As he hung up, a soft whisper filled the air, right behind him. "You should not have looked." Daniel spun around, gun raised, but the room was empty, except for the painting of Eleanor. Her lips were now curved in a slight smile, and her eyes, they were no longer hollow. Chapter 8. The Final Puzzle. The air inside Ravenshire Gallery was thick with tension. Sergeant Daniel Carter had spent the entire night flipping through old records, trying to make sense of what he had uncovered. Eleanor Winslow was a lie. Her real name was Eleanor Whitmore, and she had died over a century ago. Yet, somehow, someone had been using her identity, And now, the last painting of Eleanor, the final piece of this puzzle, was in danger. Someone was trying to erase her from history. But why? Daniel needed answers, and he was running out of time. The hidden portrait. Daniel stormed through the gallery's dimly lit corridors, his flashlight bouncing off the wooden floors. The entire Ravenshire art collection had been packed away after the break-in, except for one painting, the final portrait of Eleanor Winslow. Daniel pushed open the storeroom doors, his breath catching in his throat. The painting was still there, covered in a white sheet, standing alone against the far wall. Daniel hesitated. His hands felt strangely cold as he reached for the sheet. He pulled it away and froze. There she was, Eleanor, standing against a stormy gray background. Her green dress, once vibrant, now seemed faded. Her face was softer, younger than in the other paintings. But something was wrong. Her eyes. They weren't hollow this time, but they weren't normal either. They were watching him, not in the way a painted figure should. It felt real. Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding. Then he noticed something else. The frame. It was different. The intricate gold frame didn't match the others in the collection. Daniel leaned in closer, running his fingers along the edges. And that's when he felt it. A thin seam running along the bottom, a hidden compartment. Someone had concealed something inside the frame. Daniel's pulse spiked. With careful hands, he pressed against the frame, feeling for a latch. Then, a soft click. The bottom of the frame slid open. Inside, wrapped in yellowed parchment, was a letter. Daniel's fingers trembled as he pulled it free. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. The letter from the past. Daniel carefully unfolded the fragile paper, his eyes scanning the elegant flowing script. The letter was dated 1894, the same year Eleanor had died. But it wasn't signed by her. It was signed by her husband, Thomas Winslow. Daniel began to read. To whomever finds this letter, I write these words with a heavy heart, knowing the truth must one day be known. I have hidden it for too long, and I fear the consequences of my silence. Eleanor Whitmore was my wife, but she was not what she seemed. She was taken from me, stolen by something that wore her face. I do not know how it happened, only that it did. One night, she was here. The next, she was different. Her voice, her movements, her very presence. It was wrong, as if something else had stepped into her skin. I tried to ignore it, to believe it was grief or madness playing tricks upon my mind. But then, the whispers began. Late at night, when I closed my eyes, I would hear her whispering to something unseen. Words in a language I did not know. And her reflection. Dear God, her reflection did not move as she did. I tried to flee, but she would not let me. And so I did the only thing I could. I ended it. I set fire to the house, believing it would rid the world of what she had become. But even as the flames rose, I saw her standing in the smoke, smiling at me. She did not burn. I do not know what she is. I only know she is not Eleanor, and she is not gone. If you are reading this, then she has returned. You must stop her. Burn the final portrait. It is the last tether. If you do not, she will live again. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He read the last words again. Burn the final portrait. It is the last tether. His hands clenched into fists. The fires, the break-ins, the stolen paintings. Someone wasn't trying to destroy history. They were trying to bring her back. And Daniel had just found the last key to doing so. The portraits. Curse. A sudden creak echoed through the gallery. Daniel's head snapped up. The door to the storeroom had swung open, and standing there, silhouetted in the dim hallway light, was a woman. Her long green dress shimmered softly in the darkness. Her face was partially hidden in shadow, but Daniel could see enough. It was Eleanor, or at least something wearing her face. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. The portrait. It wasn't just a painting. It was a door, and now it was open. Eleanor's lips curved into a soft smile. Her eyes, black as the void, locked onto his. You shouldn't have read that, she whispered. And then the lights flickered out. Darkness swallowed the room, and the whispering began. Chapter 9. The Farewell. The gallery was plunged into darkness. Daniel Carter's breath came in short gasps as the whispering surrounded him, soft, sinister. Every syllable coiled around his mind like fingers tightening around his throat. He could feel her presence, Eleanor, standing just beyond the flickering shadows. Not the Eleanor from history. Not the woman painted in elegant green silk. This was something else entirely. Something ancient. Something wrong. Daniel's pulse pounded against his skull. He couldn't stay here. The letter had told him exactly what he needed to do. Burn the final portrait. Destroy the last tether. But Eleanor, or whatever wore her face, was blocking the only exit. Daniel tightened his grip on the letter, the old parchment crackling in his sweaty palms. He needed time, and he needed fire. The escape plan. Daniel's eyes darted around the storeroom, searching for anything he could use. The gallery's emergency lights flickered once, then died again, leaving him in almost total darkness. He reached for his pocket flashlight, clicking it on. The beam was weak, but enough to illuminate the dusty wooden shelves filled with old art supplies. Then, his eyes locked onto something. A small, half-used can of paint thinner. A spark of hope ignited in his chest. If he could get to it, a whisper brushed his ear. "You don't have to do this, Daniel." His blood ran ice cold. She was closer. He whirled around, shining the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just shadows shifting. He forced himself to move, reaching for the paint thinner. But the moment his fingers brushed the metal can, a hand, cold as death, closed around his wrist, the nightmare face of Eleanor. Daniel's scream caught in his throat as he spun around and came face to face with her. Eleanor, or the thing pretending to be Eleanor. Up close. Her features were wrong. The high cheekbones were too sharp. Her smile stretched too wide, like a crack forming across porcelain. And her eyes, God, her eyes, black voids, swallowing every sliver of light. Daniel yanked his arm free, stumbling. Backward, Eleanor tilted her head as if amused. "You still don't understand, do you?" she whispered. Her voice sounded like it came from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the shadows themselves. Daniel's fingers tightened around the can of paint thinner. "I understand enough," he shot back. "You're not supposed to be here." Eleanor laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "You don't get to decide that." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Neither do you." And then he threw the paint thinner at her feet. The liquid splashed across the wooden floor, soaking into the grain. Eleanor's smile didn't fade. Not yet. But Daniel wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his lighter. With one flick, a small flame danced to life. For the first time, Eleanor's expression shifted. "Daniel." He dropped the lighter. "The fire begins." Phoom. The fire roared to life, flames licking across the storeroom floor. The shadows jerked and twisted, and Eleanor let out an inhuman shriek. Daniel didn't wait. He spun on his heel, charging toward the only other exit, a back door leading to the alleyway. Behind him, the fire spread, hungry and wild. The portrait. It needed to burn completely. He had to make sure. Daniel grabbed a broken chair from the storage pile and hurled it into the flames, feeding the inferno. Eleanor's screams warped into something else, a low, guttural voice, speaking in a language Daniel didn't recognize. The ground beneath him rumbled. The air thickened, as if something was being dragged from the walls of reality itself. Daniel turned for one last look. Through the smoke and fire, Eleanor stood in the center of the flames, her dress untouched, but her face, it was cracking like porcelain shattering. From the inside out, and her eyes, they weren't black anymore. They were filling with fire, and for the first time, Eleanor looked afraid. Daniel. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was pleading. Please. The final goodbye. Daniel's chest ached. The fire was spreading fast, filling the storeroom with thick black smoke. His lungs burned, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. He wanted to believe her, to believe that she was real, and that some part of Eleanor still existed inside the fire. But then, she lunged forward, her mouth opening too wide, revealing a black abyss inside her throat. A void, an endless nothingness. Daniel slammed the door shut. The flames roared behind it. The gallery was lost, but it didn't matter, because so was she. Forever. Daniel staggered outside, coughing violently as he collapsed onto the pavement. The night sky stretched above him, cool and empty, indifferent to the horror that had just unfolded inside. Sirens wailed in the distance. Daniel looked down at his hands, soot-covered, trembling. It was over. Eleanor was gone. But as he turned his gaze back to the burning gallery, for a split second, he swore he saw her, standing inside the flames, watching him, her lips moving, whispering something he couldn't hear. Then the building collapsed, swallowing her completely, and Eleanor Winslow was no more. Chapter 10. The Ghosts We Carry. The fire had burned through the night. By the time the firefighters had extinguished the last embers, the Winslow Gallery was nothing more than a charred skeleton of what it once was. Daniel Carter stood at the edge of the destruction, his fingers wrapped tightly around the old locket he had found in the ruins. Inside was a faded photograph. Eleanor Winslow, young and full of life, her eyes still holding the light that had long since faded from her spirit. He had done it. He had freed her, but at what cost? The aftermath. The town of Ravenshire had been buzzing with speculation since the fire. The newspapers called it an unfortunate accident, blaming an electrical fault for the blaze. Daniel didn't correct them, because who would believe the truth? That the spirit of Eleanor Winslow had been trapped for over a century, bound to the paintings that bore her likeness, that her whispers had twisted through the air, haunting the gallery, warping reality itself? No, they wouldn't believe it. But Daniel knew the truth, and so did Eleanor. Lingering shadows. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the reports that didn't tell the real story. The gallery was gone. Eleanor was gone, but something still felt unfinished. Part of him had expected that when the fire consumed the last painting, everything would feel lighter, that the whispers would stop, that he could finally close this chapter of his life. But as he sat there in the quiet of his apartment, he realized the silence felt wrong, because in the absence of the whispers, a different kind of weight settled in, not the weight of fear, but of loss. A letter from the past. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Daniel frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, a manila envelope lay on the floor. No name, no return address, just a single wax seal pressed with a W. His breath caught in his throat. Winslow. Heart pounding, he tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter, aged, handwritten. The ink had faded with time, but the words were still clear. To the one who found me, I was never meant to be here. I was never meant to be trapped between this world and the next. You freed me. But there is more. There always is. Not all ghosts fade, Daniel. Some we carry with us, and some never leave. Eleanor Winslow. Daniel's hand shook. He flipped the letter over, and his breath left his body, because there, at the bottom of the page, in fresh ink, a single sentence had been added, a sentence that hadn't been there before. Turn around. The reflection. Daniel's body went rigid. A chill rolled down his spine. Slowly, so slowly, he turned and froze. In the reflection of his living room mirror, a woman stood behind him, not a ghost, not a whisper, but Eleanor Winslow, as she had been in life, Her green dress flowed gently, untouched by time. Her face soft and human, no longer the twisted specter he had seen in the flames. And her eyes, they held something new. Peace, understanding, but also a warning. The ghosts we carry. Daniel blinked, and she was gone. Just the reflection of his empty apartment remained, but he felt her presence linger, like the last note of a song fading into silence. He looked down at the letter again, at those final words. Some ghosts never leave. He understood now. Eleanor had been freed from the paintings, but she was never the only ghost in Ravenshire. There were others, stories that had been buried, just like hers, secrets that had been forgotten, and Daniel knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.